All right, so I'm excited to introduce you all to our guests today. We have a Derek Wong, who is a design system designer, formerly from HP and Roblox. And we're also joined by Hector Jaime, who is senior product designer at Pinterest. And I am Michelle Chin, a design advocate at Zero Height. So, um, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining. And I wanted to kick things off with some intros. So, tell us a little bit about your design system experience, what you currently do, maybe a fun fact about yourself if you'd like to share. Derek, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure thing. Also, thanks, Michelle and Zero Height, for this opportunity. Hey everyone, I'm Derek. My pronouns are he, him. I was at HP for 2 years and Roblox for 4.5 years. I'm also a plant daddy. I'm also on the board of directors for a soon-to-be nonprofit called SF Gamers. We are an organization that connects LGBTQIA gamers around the Bay Area, and we also give back to the community. So that's what I've been doing in my time after Roblox, but it's exciting to be here.
Very cool. And Hector might have had to move locations. So, um, let's dig in a little bit about your experience with design systems. So, tell us about I guess, your most recent design system team and maybe its evolution, so the audience has a little bit of context.
Totally. So Roblox's design system is called UI Blocks. And for those that don't know, Roblox is an organization that brings folks around the world together through play, through virtual experiences. Um, People kind of call it a gaming company, but they're trying to expand more than that. They have virtual concerts. They have virtual hangout spaces. It's really becoming more broader than that. And so their products was the main Roblox app experience. They have Roblox Studio, which is to create the experiences, and then they have a bunch of peripheral products. So UI Blocks was mainly just for the main Roblox app experience, and all the other ones were kind of modeled after our design system. When I joined in 2019, there's about a group of 4 or 5 people on the design system team, and then going into 2020 and 2021, it had shrunk down to 3, then 2, and then I was the only person on design systems for about a year, maybe a year and a half. And then the most recent iteration was myself, um, a lead design system person, and then a design system engineer, like a design engineer hybrid. We had engineers that we pulled in from other resources, but essentially that was our most recent iteration of the team.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like smaller teams are very much what's typical these days. I think before it seemed like you had to have like a whole, I don't know, a gaggle of people to create a design system. Uh, Hector, I was wondering if you could introduce yourself, share a little bit about your experience, what you do, maybe a fun fact, and tell us a little bit about your design system team and its evolution.
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Hector Jaime. I'm currently a staff product designer on the Gestalt design system at Pinterest. I've been working on this system here now for a little over 2.5 years. My main focus has been components and patterns for our kind of business enterprise side of the product. So if you use Pinterest, it's like the other side for advertisers and businesses that you may not always see as a user of Pinterest. And I've also worked on the visual design for our documentation site, which is public, and information architecture. I've been working on systems for a while. Before that, it's kind of smaller systems that for enterprise companies. One called Rio Design System at Automation Anywhere, and Fluid Design System at Cloudera. This is the first one I've done that's got a dedicated team where I'm not kind of also getting pulled into feature work and that kind of a story. And I think just since I was a graphic designer, visual designer in some capacity, I'd always been working on style guides and identity systems and that kind of stuff. So systems just kind of it felt like a natural progression in product for me. Fun fact, I was in a punk band in the 90s. We put out records and toured the country in a van and made about, on average, $50 a night or something. Lots of ramen, cheap ramen being eaten. Sorry, did you want me to go through the evolution of our system or?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, so Gestalt was actually started by engineers because there was a migration to React that needed to happen. And I apologize, I had a room that I had reserved, some mishap happened, so I got kicked out. But so they wanted to just have a kind of reusable UI framework. Design had as a separate project, had a design standards, and that wasn't connected to code, and that was the case for a while, just due to circumstances. And then at some point, the team was created to unify those standards with the web pattern library, and that became the Gestalt team. And then we've grown quite a bit since I started. And we've got about 6 designers, some full-time, some contractors. We now have a program manager, iconographer, illustrator, and 2 design technologists that are kind of bridge the gap between engineering and design. And then we have engineers on various teams that aren't officially on the Gestalt team, but they either are full-time dedicated to design systems work or part-time, contributing to the design systems work. And we collaborate a lot and talk with all those teams. It's expanded from, it was primarily a web design system, and now it's been expanded to include our native iOS and Android. So that's kind of all in the works now, with adding more and more components to iOS and Android.
Very cool. Yeah, it's interesting and really cool to hear the evolution of and origin stories of how design systems come to be. Especially, I don't know, it's interesting that it was like an engineering initiative, because I think a lot of times, it starts off with like the design team building like some sort of kit and then wanting to scale that. Really quickly, wanted to jump into a question Mel had asked. I'm curious to hear how many designers the design system teams are supporting, or how many consumers do you have of the design system?
I'll go first. The most recent count I had was about 30 designers.
We have around, I want to say it's around 100. And that is a combination of designers, product designers, and content designers. Then engineering, I don't know the number. It's pretty big, So, but yeah, it's quite. I mean, Pinterest is about 5,000 employees or so, so it's quite large.
And another interesting thing about the UI blocks is that because there are about maybe up to 11 other products that Roblox makes, and they don't have design systems people, so the designers on that team would always come to us for office hours.
Oh.
So that we support, even more designers than just the 30 on product.
Very cool. Yeah, I think people love hearing about how things kind of work and how people can navigate and make the most out of a situation. Wanted to jump into some stuff from the actual report, so I'll share some slides. All right. So I think in our report, we found that 68% of people are starting documentation within their with their design system within a year of starting their actual design system. And I always felt like, documentation, like even 5 years ago, kind of took a backseat of like, we need to make all these like component libraries and then we'll document them all. But this seems to indicate that that's not the case anymore. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on why this might have changed? Or hot takes too?
Yeah, I have some I have several hypotheses around why it is. I think partially, the general design systems have matured, and there's a lot of content out there to reference, and it's just part of what's expected. Oh, you have a design system, you have to have you include documentation, and it's pretty easy to ramp up now given the amount of open source content that's out there to reference. There's more tools for it, either things like Zero Height or Storybook, or even just Notion and Coda, that make it, simple enough to document. And I also think perhaps one thing that has sort of pushed more towards documentation is remote work and distributed teams. So you can no longer, I used to go see the work in this like lean UX way of just like minimal documentation, and just as long as you kind of pushed out product and you always had someone to just ask in the office, and that's with being distributed, then I think it kind of makes documentation necessary.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't think about the remote work aspect, but I definitely resonate when now that there's a lot more resources available, because there was so few at the time. It was hard to kind of figure out what you even had to document. And yeah, very cool. All right. So in terms of what we're documenting, there's quite a bit that people are documenting. And this slide, you can get this full information in the report, so you don't have to read it all. But essentially, we ask people, what are the things that you're documenting for your design system? And out of all these things, I don't know, Hector, if you have any thoughts around, um, you know, are there things that people should be documenting as a priority, but they might not realize it's a priority, and why that might be the case?
Um, yeah, I think, I mean, the two things that I thought of, one that I've been thinking about recently a lot is naming, because I feel like, and I'm guilty of it, when it comes to naming things, everyone just kind of throws it's like, oh, hashtag naming is hard. And it's like, well, it's all hard. Everything here is hard, right? So, but we've figured out how to come up with systems for it. So I think naming, and we don't have ours documented, and so it's one thing that I think we should, and more teams should have. I would say like Nord Health does a pretty good job, a really good job of that, just coming up with a naming system for components, tokens, and so on. I think the other one is, yeah, actually it's here, but I think I think more of it needs to happen is governance processes and internal processes and so on. Even I just ran into this. GitLab has this YouTube channel called GitLab Unfiltered, and it's like all of their engineering and design reviews and critiques recorded for everyone to see. And it's, in a way, it's, to me, it's kind of sometimes even more valuable than documenting a button component or something, because every button component kind of says the same thing. So it's like these sort of new things that, like, oh, I get to see how the processes that get to a design or to a design decision. And I think that that's pretty valuable as well.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is like sometimes it's really helpful to have that context as to like why a team landed on a certain decision versus like, here you go, here's your button or here's your dashboard. This is what you have to use, but more of that why. Derek, I don't know if you had any thoughts to share.
Well, plus one for the governance. I think, especially when you have a big company, like getting everyone on board to, how you're going to be moving forward in the design system is crucial. And related to that, I do see up here on the second column principles. I think that could be overlooked, especially if you are on a newer design team, or if you have a lot of newer designers in the design system team. This would help guide like everything about the process, and even to help illustrate and educate your stakeholders on how you're building your design system.
Yeah, for sure. Um, that is a really really good point. It's why you get up and come into work. Uh, all right. So let me go to the next slide. All right. So this one's about documentation coverage by documentation age. So um, as you can expect, more of the design system is covered and documented as the design system gets older. Um, but wanted to see if you had any thoughts that, like, if people are um, taking longer to get more of their design system documented, what advice could you give to those teams that could help them improve their coverage?
I think an obvious one is make use of Figma embeds. A lot of people think that they have to do everything from scratch, but now that we have Figma embeds, and as long as you structure your when you're working on when you're working on the guidelines for your system, um, you can work with an engineer to just get it embedded, so that way it's already updated. It's not as complicated as you think.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a good one, right? I mean, it's just in general about just being resourceful and just use what you have, and it's don't worry about perfection. That sometimes even means that you might have some things in a Google Doc and another thing in Confluence or whatever, but as long as it's there for people to find and to point to. I would say the other one is, if you have access to Chat GPT or another AI tool, just use it to help you write documentation, particularly the more generic stuff, you know, and I think that can help you kind of be able to cover more areas. And that what we've done too is actually taken contributions from other teams, even non-design teams, to help us with the first actually our international design guidelines. Those were all written by our international globalization team, and then we just tweaked them to fit into our system. So
Yeah, I think that's what's cool is that if your organization does have a team that handles globalization or translations, they often actually have a lot of good UI advice because they have to think about how sentences and phrases translate, and it doesn't always translate one to one, and sometimes verbs come at the end or at the beginning and that type of thing. So it's a really good it's very helpful in terms of being a product designer to kind of figure out how you need to design UI. And I wanted to talk about, while we're on the topic of documentation, we asked people, what were their top challenges, and they can select multiple answers from a variety of things. So the biggest one was not enough resources, so like time and people. Um, so when it comes to this, like what guidance can you give to teams who might be struggling in terms of documenting because they don't have enough time or resources?
I think it's part of what I mentioned before, right? Just leverage what's out there. It can be, you know, like third-party tools, even if it's Confluence, just somewhere where you can put stuff there. Uh, yeah, leveraging AI, um, and yeah, pretty much what I said before. Just sort of like not aim for perfection, but just have it. Sometimes it might just be in Figma itself, and be okay with a pause. Even now, I think as I say this, like we haven't really done much documentation this quarter, and that's okay, right? We'll get back to it soon. So um,
Yeah, I think the last webinar we had, we talked about how design systems aren't about like a hurry up and get it done, but it's really about like stability. It's a foundational thing, so it's just going to be stable, and it should be stable, and it should be around for a long time. So things do take longer. And Derek, I'm curious, since you worked with a scrappier design system team, how did you navigate getting things documented in a way that was helpful?
Yeah, really, most of my time at Roblox was just on Confluence and Figma. Um, but I would say if I were to answer this question for anything of not enough resources, like get buy-in from teams, like kind of tie it to business goals and everything you need to do. But if you can find an engineer that is passionate about documentation and getting their team on board, like that's definitely a surefire way to. That's what we did at Roblox.
Yeah, that's interesting because my next question has to do with design system adoption with developers. So I'd love to get your take on this. Teams always, typically mention that they struggle to get developers on board with referencing design system documentation. And I'm curious, what do you think creates that struggle? And what are some things teams can do to encourage people to reference documentation? Um, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because we had kind of the opposite problem where developers are referencing our docs sometimes more than designers do. I think the way we did it, well, first of all, it kind of helped that it was started. It was a system that was originally started by developers, so there was already that interest there. But the way that what's helped us is to just be to have live code examples and the ability to just sort of like see in the documentation how something works and even being able to grab code snippets from it. Having like guidelines that aren't arbitrary. So one developer had mentioned that they like Gestalt because we have a clear rationale for why things are. So they might disagree, but then they read the rationale and it's okay, good. So I try to do that. Like it's not just don't do this period, but don't do this, or do this period, but do this because. And I think just over time, as developers, even designers, see how it speeds up their general processes to refer to the documentation site and also give them the opportunity to give feedback and ask for changes and contribute.
I
Yeah.
have an interesting story about at Roblox where we had a pop-up alert. And for some reason, I guess maybe the engineer was new. They didn't know that this pop-up alert was in our design system. So they coded it from scratch. And we were all confused why it looked different than everything else on the page. And so the communication that was missing there was that they didn't know what in Figma was a component and what wasn't. So the way that we solved that was I created a widget for product designers can put into the document, and you can just plug in, hey, here are all the UI blocks components that are used on this page. I want to actually I want to ask Hector if you have any like how would you solve that kind of problem?
Yeah, it's happened as well, or even something like, well, they know that component exists, but it didn't do something they wanted, and they just in a rush just coded something from scratch as opposed to asking for the change, not knowing who to ask, that kind of stuff. I mean, it really just been and the team has done a great job before me of just a lot of evangelizing and a lot of like communication constantly of like, hey, like there's this thing called Gestalt, and you should look there first and leverage it first. And oftentimes it feels weird, but sometimes it just means just kind of repeating these things over and over again in channels and stuff, and just as much as possible getting the word out that it exists.
Yeah, I think like I've seen teams do make the design system part of their onboarding process, and that way people can get off to a good start. I think also, to some extent, it might be the designer's responsibility as they're presenting designs and a flow to identify, hey, this is a new component. This isn't in the design system, or everything here is in the design system. Because yeah, otherwise, harmlessly, someone can end up coding something from scratch that they didn't have to. All right, so we're about halfway through. So if people have questions, feel free to mention them in the chat. And let's see. I guess from our report, let me go to this. We learned that almost a third still don't have a contribution model, so like that governance process for the design system, and very few have an effective one. And Derek, I'm really curious to see like how your thoughts on how people might navigate this challenge and get to an effective contribution model.
Sure, I could just talk about what we did at Roblox, but I don't know if that may help some people. That might not. When Roblox started out, we didn't even have dedicated design system engineers. So our goal on design systems was to identify which teams needed design system components, and then have kickoff meetings with the engineers from that team, and just like kind of teach them how to contribute to our system. And and then we had one sort of dedicated engineer. They kind of spent half their time on design systems, but that was enough for us. And they would also do some education. Um, in terms of designers contributing, that one was really fun because this wasn't until maybe 2 years into, at least 2 years into my tenure at Roblox. Um, one of our designers had done a really good job of kind of emulating our documentation um, for a component, and it was a component that they were working on. And so that really helps to make templates in Figma to really like point out what is important for someone who wants to contribute to the system. Yeah, there's just a lot of really, I don't know. That's the experience that I had at Roblox.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that because I think a lot of times we see a lot of these documentation sites that are like so picture perfect and have everything, and I don't know, like it just seems like so sometimes it seems very out of reach for people when they see these processes and stuff. Um and I think to add to that, like I think, whatever contribution process of like collaboration and feedback loops that you have with your existing team, um, if that can translate into some sort of contribution process, I think that's also easier because people are familiar with that and they're not having to learn something new and change their workflow entirely. Um, and so, Hector, I see you're back. We were just talking about getting to like effective contribution models. And I'd love to hear more because I really love how Gestalt has a dedicated system or section called team support, which is really robust. And I'd love to hear more about how this came about and how helpful it's been for teams that consume your design system.
Oh yeah, thanks. And yeah, sorry, it's a lot of difficulties today. I didn't anticipate. Yeah, we that was started actually by Cynthia, who's another designer here. She took the lead and created that section as we thought more about the design system, not just as like artifacts and guidelines, but also as a service, and how we're just also here to support teams and and collaborate and have them contribute. So that's how that first started, and it was a very much a, as we tend to work, it's like let's get something out there, and then we will update and iterate along the way. In fact, I've actually been the past few months I've been working on updating our contribution model, and I think in about probably by next week there's going to be a big update to that section. So there's some new stuff there. I think, and as I think teams have really appreciated the kind of openness and the collaboration, and it's helped them add things to our system. Some examples are like our form pattern guidelines, data visualization, color palette was originally contributed from an outside designer, and having a place to direct people to, like if you have a request or contribution, this is where you can go to get started. I think one of the learnings and the feedback that I got as we started thinking about how we can expand on this was that there wasn't a clear process still in terms of once you contribute something, how do you get it to the finish line? It was all very sort of a bit kind of informal. We just sort of worked through it together. So that's sort of the next step in the learning is, and my advice for people is just like to be prepared to have to make changes and evolve it. So the next step is to come up with which I've been working on now, is a clearer process for how you contribute, and also to think about just be mindful of the fact that people not on design system team have got other responsibilities and other sort of expertise and other things that they're responsible for. So they're not going to be, and I'm talking for design here, not for engineering, but it's design specific. They're not going to be able to just sort of hand you a fully spec'd component, because that's not what they do on their day-to-day, and they've got other product initiatives that they're responsible and stuff like that. So just just being aware of that and coming up with a model that keeps that in mind so that people can still contribute without feeling like they have to do everything.
Yeah, that makes complete sense because I know, and also like creating design system components is also a special skill almost. You have to be very detail oriented to think through, okay, is this a stroke? Is this an outline? What is it? The colors and making sure, especially when if you're using Figma, thinking about how components and variations would work. Like I feel like that's a whole different skill set than just being a product designer. And some people really love that stuff, and some people don't, for sure. Wanted to jump to some audience questions. So Sarah had asked, I feel like I've been seeing a lot of AI enthusiasts speak on how AI will eliminate or lessen the need for design system teams altogether. Love to hear more about how y'all see AI complementing rather than usurping design system teams. Anyone have any hot takes or thoughts?
I mean, it's a legitimate concern. I think if it's going to happen, it's not going to happen anytime soon, just based on my experience with it. If anything, it's personally allowed me to just get all of the basics out of the way and focus on the fun stuff and the more kind of the bigger problems and the harder problems that I personally like to work on. So, and again, for mainly, it's just basically for me, it's been answering, basic kind of, documentation or standards things that, you could just research quickly too by doing a bunch of internet searches, but that sort of makes it more efficient to be able to move forward. And I speak, and again, I would say like this is just my opinion. It's not like a Pinterest opinion, but just my personal opinion on it. I've tried some of these things that supposedly help you build UI with AI, and I personally haven't found them very useful. So, we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I'm not that worried about it. I think it's more still about an assistant than a and it's kind of, and it lets people then also not have to be constantly answering questions and just instead focus on the design or move on to new projects and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Derek, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not scared of AI taking my job. We use AI to help like write design tokens. Like if we want to have like a structure for how do we name those things. Building UI, we've created our own tools at Roblox to build UI. It's not we don't use AI to make it. When I think about having AI build UI, I don't understand how it works because you have to somehow hook it up with our color system, our componentry naming, the way that we use icons. There's just so much involved in that if you're just building AI without anything, it just looks pretty, but it's not going to be connected to our system at all. And even if it does, I mean, maybe teams can build bespoke AI tools within the company. But even then, it doesn't replace someone actually like making the connections of how to build components and everything.
Yeah, for sure. So everyone can, I don't know, breathe a sigh of relief that we're not getting replaced immediately. I do like it for as a way to understand, like, just streamline a lot of the busy work that we have to do, right? Like documentation is a lot, but and I wrote an article which we can share in the show notes on like how you can use a ChatGPT prompt to create design system documentation. Which is super quick. Like the fact that it could, generate documentation in a matter of seconds, and then you can go in and edit as you need to, makes your job a lot easier. So it's definitely a great assistant. And then Theophile asked, would AI help automate accessibility checks in a design system? Have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't. I know that, I mean, we already do automated accessibility checks that like scripts that developers have written so that when For example, if I do a good amount of our site updates and adding icons to the repo, kind of stuff like that. When I push, or create a pull request, then those tests happen automatically, and then I'll get flags if something isn't accessible. I mean, I'm assuming that AI can do something like that. I wouldn't know exactly how. And there's some consternation. I know that was there's a recent article by Jacob Nielsen, the researcher, that has been getting a lot of negative feedback because it kind of talked about AI for accessibility, and a lot of accessibility advocates felt that it was problematic as far. I mean, you can look it up on it. So I'm not sure how AI can help with that, but perhaps it makes writing scripts that developers already do. There's already automated tests faster.
Yeah, I'm curious. We'll share the article in the show notes. If you go back to the page with this webinar, you'll get links to that. But I'm really interested in seeing what that looks like. I know Luke, who's also a design advocate at Zero Height, wrote a white paper on AI, and they mentioned that you can do some testing. So like, I guess they shared a screenshot with ChatGPT and they were like, hey, are these colors accessible? And then through the magic of AI, I guess I'm not really sure how it works, but it could tell the color contrast and let you know. But I think, Hector, like you said, like, there's a lot of developer tools already that can do a lot of this stuff. So I think, it might be helpful for other like designers to consider like chatting with the developers to see kind of what processes are built in, or what processes can be used for testing for accessibility. And I think like as an accessibility nerd, like there's some things that robots can do, but at the same time, you need to think about that human's experience, which can be very different than being compliant.
Yeah, it just sounds like maybe you're just looking for automated tools to help you check accessibility. It's not necessarily AI. Like Stark, for example, is just a Figma plugin. It's not AI, right? And then there's things on accessibility that are not like immediately checkable. For example, like motion. Having reduced motion would be accessible, but you can't check that with a tool. You have to just know that as a designer.
Yeah, very good point. All right. Let's see. Carlos, so related to AI, this is a very interesting topic for everybody. Would we always need design system documentation as data to train a model, and then it can put pages together?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, I don't know about putting the pages together. That'd be amazing, right? But you do need some documentation to train the model initially. I think that after that, there's ways that you can tweak the answers of AI with just your own human input, and not necessarily, although in a way that's still documentation, right? But it's not off in a official documentation site. That's as far as I know. I don't have enough experience beyond actually training models beyond that. But again, to me, it just kind of points to the importance of having documentation, because how else are you going to start training something to learn?
Yeah, I think, it's like kind of balancing like when do we make time to figure out how AI can do something versus what do we have available today that we could do that, which might actually be more quicker, for sure. We can switch gears if you would, if you would like. So Kevin asks, should a startup be dedicating limited resources to establishing a design system?
I think about if your company puts a high priority on scale. If you think you're just going to stay on one platform and whatnot, then maybe just establish the basics. But if if your company wants to think about scale and you think the company is going to grow, then design system is crucial for that.
Yeah. And Hector, do you have any thoughts?
Um, yeah, I think I just agree with Derek. Like, you just kind of think ahead about about scaling. There's a very real, I mean, just from working at startups before, there's a very real, the reality of immediate sort of business needs that make that hard, or you may have to start by, what I've done in the past is like, okay, well, our design system is basically material UI, and we just put some guidelines around using that. But I get let's go back to trying to get buy-in though from stakeholders about why it's important to start with a good foundation versus having to scramble later, having things get too unruly. Um, so I'd say yes, but just form fitted to where your startup currently is.
Yeah, for sure. And, a design system doesn't necessarily mean like, a full design system out of the gate, right? It takes years to build one and get it complete. So, even if your design system for right at the moment is just Figma reusable components, because that will help everyone who is designing maintain their sanity. So, even that can be your design system at the moment, before getting to further things like coding the library and the documentation for sure. So, all right. So Jackie asks, how would you go about allowing innovation on the team to happen with net new component contributions versus abiding to the design system? So I guess if there is a design system component that they could use, but they want to innovate a little bit and want to make a new one, how what is that process like when adding that to the design system and documentation?
Yeah, it's a very timely question because that's what I've been working on recently. So, I mean, as mentioned before, the way we've done it is to try to I've created these templates to make it kind of simple for designers to contribute without a lot of overhead. But we've really um, made it kind of trying to make it clear that it's not a free for all, and that there has to be like a very good business um, justification for wanting to contribute something new or wanting to change something. And keep in mind too, and this is just for us internally, of particularly since Pinterest is it's about 10-year-old product, right? It's got a lot of users. The big picture of like this change may have resulted in some good feedback, or good, in our case, like metrics, right? And that in experiments, we do a lot of experiments, but it's, you got to make sure that it can also, it's not really part of the design system if it doesn't also do the same for other surfaces, for other products, and still be very I guess the word adamant that the core principles and the core foundations need to be applied. And then you can come up with decisions like that. Okay, that maybe this is an alternative component or a related component to something that already exists. Like it doesn't introduce redundancies, and it makes sense for this particular use case. So it becomes a variation of a component that works in these certain cases. If you can make that kind of a case, because you don't want to make things so rigid and so consistent they just become kind of boring and uniform, right? There's a fine line between uniformity and consistency, but I still feel like that there still has to be some principles in some cases where it's just it's a no-go, right? Like we have something perfectly fine in the system that you can use.
Yeah, similar here at Roblox. We always try to lean designers towards what we already have. But this also kind of reminds me of something that we did at Roblox called slots. So it's you design a component like a tile or something. Maybe the tile has two sections, and so you create slot components for both of those, and then teams can, if they want to experiment, run A/B tests um, on that. They don't have to detach the component, and they don't even have to, you know, make a component from scratch. They could just use whatever that's in code. Um, so it allows them to have the flexibility without, like having to make something that's off guide, like off of our guidelines.
Yeah, that's super interesting. But yeah, that balance is really hard. Um, and okay, I love the questions that are coming in. These are all really great. So we've been talking about like a lot about design and development. But Gizem, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, um, was curious as well as some others. Do you want to share about content design systems or the design systems content aspect? How do you work with content designers to create a system?
Um, that's a great question, and we're lucky enough to have basically our content designers come up with the content standards that then we brought into our documentation for people to refer to, and then as much as possible try to get everyone to, as they're creating UI, to adhere to those standards. We've been also, whenever it's possible, again, these teams get busy, but whenever it's possible, it had been, you know, relying on content design, if not just by referencing their standards, by asking content designers of our own documentation, like how is it content-wise. So yeah, I think it's just mainly if you have content designers, if just finding out if they're okay with including all the guidelines in the system. And in our case, the content designer even just implemented the guidelines themselves. They just got into GitHub and created it, and it went into our site. That's the extent of I know of, other than the general partnership of content designers, which is like asking them about UI language and things like that to align.
Cool, Derek. I don't know if you had any thoughts to share.
Oh, I mean, Hector said it great. We didn't get a content designer until very, very late into our design system. So we didn't really establish like a process yet. But I think it really helped out with standardizing just the way that we even our team like I guess like structures the grammar of our components.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. So we have another very popular question. So Mel is asking any thoughts on how to develop best practices and processes for design systems for teams of one or that are just starting up. So for context, they say I'm 8 months into building a design system at a startup and struggling to figure out if my processes and next steps are correct. Most of the resources out there are well developed for large teams. So I guess if you think about material and IBM's Carbon, yeah, any thoughts or advice for Mel?
I guess it depends on if they are using the federated model for design systems. When I was the only design system person at Roblox, um, I heavily leaned on, product designers at the company that I knew that were interested in contributing to the system, as well as engineers. Um, but I guess the question is more about process. Um, I think it's just understanding how much resources you have, um, and then figuring out how to get, I guess, people to contribute to it.
Yeah, Hector, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think when you're small like that, I'd say that not worry too much about whether things are correct. I remember there's a very good article past that the Figma team wrote a while back. It was called like Scrappy. If you look it up, it's like Scrappy Design Systems Teams. And there's just some good guidelines there about, just, I would say it's just like, just use what you already know as a product designer works for like building product and apply that to a design system and be ready to just be scrappy and make some compromises. Take what's out there for bigger teams and analyze it and see what can apply to your. I've been a design system team of one, and in cases like, and it's like, okay, well, it's going to handle. We're just going to worry about like the foundations and the small components in Figma, and then just build it and just work with our design processes that we already have internally and just get it out there. But it's a great question, yeah, because I agree. And now that I've been in a bigger team for a while, I'm like finding myself a little trying to remember, how did I did that? How did I do all that before I I had all these resources?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's like the dream, right? Is to like have that dedicated team, but a lot of people don't have that luxury. So and I myself have had that experience too. Um and I think yeah, that's the thing is like it design systems very much similar to like the design process, right? So typical best practices. I think, it's worth mentioning that if you feel like you're at capacity or you can't get things further, it's not a fault of you, but like you would need additional resources. And that's, start planting that seed with your manager. So they know ahead of time before you're just like, 9 months later, you're just really like angry and stressed and needing somebody. But like if you can plant that seed earlier, but hey, we're gonna need more resources. That can help them secure, either another person or maybe find some people that can help support you to make it more tangible. Great. We have about 5 minutes left, and we'll ask this one question from Ingrid, which we kind of touched on a little bit, but she would like to hear more. So, have any of you integrated localization into your design system, and how did you do that? Did you organize it by language or by categories, like a standard design system? Um, yeah, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I worked with our internationalization team on this. So there's two things. I mean, previously in our web components, we already had, like in the code examples, a way for people to test right to left, right, and test localization for things like date fields, number fields, that kind of stuff. And then we expanded further by taking the guidelines that they had written on best practices for localization and put them under our foundations under international design. And the way we did it is basically, just took the basics. So, okay, this is how things work in right to left languages, and the key things that we have issues with or need specific help with localizing. So currency, numbers, icons, and did it that way, not necessarily as a per language way, but more as it's kind of more broader key things that people tend to have questions on as they try to localize UI. So that's the beginning. There'll probably be more to come, but those were the things that we felt were the most necessary for people to know.
Yeah, right. It's not much of a language category. It's like right to left is a category in itself. And then languages with long words, that's more of an accessibility thing. Like how does your design system handle languages with long words? And then one thing I did that was really interesting was how do we abbreviate numbers? I realized that different languages abbreviate numbers differently. That was wild. I think like, if we said like 10,000, we would say 10K, right? But I believe in Chinese, they go by every 10,000. Not instead of every, like 1,000 is 1K, but then they would go off of the 10,000 anyway. So and I think Russian did something different too. So that was another interesting thing to think about when it comes to languages.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think, yeah, and when you're designing, because languages are so nuanced that you kind of have to design for something more universal. So how can a component, where would the money symbol sign go, and how can that be interchanged easily without having to customize it for every language? Because there's so many nuances for sure. All right, so
Yeah.
we're at time, and I definitely want to thank Derek and Hector for joining us today. Really good stuff, really great questions, really great thoughts and insight that you provided from your experiences. So thank you so much for joining, and we really appreciate it. So I hope to catch everyone again soon, and then Hector and Derek, I hope to see you in person at Hella Design Meetup at some point. So if you are in the Bay Area, I have a meetup called Hella Design System, and we just kind of hang out and chat about design systems. So if you have other questions, you are welcome to come. And you can find that on Meetup if you Google search that, but we'll put that in the show notes. So thank you again, Hector and Derek, and everyone else who attended.